golf is the area you've gone into online. So are you training any golf athletes, or is it mainly, as you mentioned, just with the facilities?
Yeah, so I've usually had like a kind of small stable of training clients over the years. A lot of it started because I just started posting about golf. I played college golf, noticed there's a big gap in kind of the strength and conditioning performance science side. It was golfers were just starting to realize that doing something from a fitness or strength and conditioning perspective would be useful when I kind of entered the space. But in terms of how to go about doing that, it was still a lot of like ground based core stability type stuff, very
Yeah,
low intensity, very stretching focused. There wasn't as much of the strength, power, more modern strength and conditioning principles hadn't made its way into the space yet. So I just started kind of posting on that side. I was working with a few golfers, picked up some steam. So a lot of that main Instagram account, I just kind of niched down into golf just because it seemed to kind
nice.
of work. I was doing some research in that space, started connecting with other people. But then obviously, so I have a few kind of golf clients, and then I'm handling a lot of the sports science data technology side for there's a golf performance facility at the PGA of America headquarters with Sports Academy and the PGA have this partnership. So I'm kind of working in that space quite a bit when I'm not doing flywheel based stuff.
Sick. So what kind of data are we talking here?
Yeah, so they're like the first thing they wanted to do is make it very like data informed. When a new client comes in, they go through a full profiling test. And so they've got Hawk and force plates, true strength. So we do a lot of the kind of standard force plate tests, counter movement jump, squat jump. We do like a 5 repeat multi rebound jump as well.
Hmm.
I like to kind of get that full picture with vertical forces. Those are kind of your big predictors of club head speed, at least from the research. Then we'll do something like a mid thigh pull. We're starting to work in some things with like they've got a beyond power. So we do a rotational power test with that. There's been some kind of
Interesting.
interesting stuff. And then we're starting to work in with the true strength, some of the like shoulder assessments, so external rotation strength and range of motion. They go through a full range of motion assessment. And then down the road, we want to do things like workload management. So we're tracking just practice volume since golf injury and pain is so overuse related that we're just
Mm,
trying to kind of, everyone talks about it being an issue of managing volume, but no one actually takes the step to track it properly in practice. It's just you're working with individual athletes for the most part, so you don't have them all under the kind of the same roof. So you have
yeah.
to like really make efforts to track that with each individual golfer. So we're trying to kind of build that out.
So what would be a volume metric? Is it just number of swings? But obviously you got different intensity of swings. You got if you're walking the course or something like that. How are you looking at volume?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I definitely want to like so at the very least you want to track the number of holes played. I try to track general time in different parts of the game, so short game versus kind of full swings, like how many. Ideally, we get an idea of how many total shots they're hitting on the driving range with kind of full swings, but that becomes kind of tricky. So a lot of it comes down to kind of time in each one of those. We might get kind of an RPE, and a lot of it is tracking kind of these general trends, but then alongside things when lower back pain spikes up, it's more of a conversation starter at this point until we get more data of just like at least the coach can see, oh, I noticed your back's bothering you today. You can kind of go back through their log and, oh, you started playing a lot more in the last few weeks. And it just leads to better conversations. But
Yeah.
it's one of those, there's no really great, well established way of tracking volume and practice intensity and things like that in golf. So you kind of have to start somewhere and kind of figure out what works and what trends you see. And I think it'll become a bigger topic over the next few years.
Yeah.
How do we actually quantify this? The problem is what would work and what a golfer will actually track is two different things. So you kind of got to get some buy-in from the coaches as well as the golfer themselves. Otherwise, it's kind of all over the place.
Unless you put like a tracker in their golf clubs or something.
Yeah, I mean, there's some out there. It's just, yeah, it's getting consistent usage of that type of stuff. There are some like sensors that go in the club and track swings through acceleration and things like that, but I don't think it's super widely used.
Yeah, I can imagine. So, so what kind of things are you seeing? I guess within your jump data or at least your physical testing data with these golfers, because obviously the rotational aspect has some carryover into combat sports as well, which would be quite interesting to kind of see what you're seeing there.
Yeah, so the big one is like counter movement jump outputs tend to be the strongest physical predictor of club head speed that we've seen over the years. Started off, everyone was very jump height heavy, but with golf, you can have a lot of different body shapes and sizes and still be successful. So we've definitely seen more consistent with things like impulse measures. So I usually measure net propulsive impulse or positive impulse, and the advantage to that is, like a bigger golfer could be putting a lot of force into the ground, but they may not propel themselves as high off the floor as you'd expect from like a smaller golfer putting the same amount of force in. And in golf, it's less about propelling your body through space and more kind of the absolute forces involved and more your force capacity within certain time frames. So counter movement jump outputs are kind of the go-to pretty consistent indicator. There's probably an argument to be made for the lead leg post up kind of vertical forces are pretty important within the swing. But I also think there's probably a degree of just like really good athletes tend to be good at a lot of things. And that includes swinging a club fast and jumping well. It's probably a kind of a general proxy for just athleticism in golf as well, where you can usually pick up on the athletes that, the golfers that have some training experience, just they jump way better than other golfers, for example. But outside of that, we do see kind of the strength measures. So mid thigh pull, both kind of the peak force, but usually within like, we'll do like force at 250 milliseconds, which is relatively representative of the downswing of golf swing. We tend to see those be kind of moderate correlates. And then we're starting to see more and more with upper body strength, especially in female golfers, maybe because it's less of an emphasis over the years.
Mm.
But that kind of the ballistic upper body side of being able to move fast with your upper body and rotational. So kind of what you'd expect, powerful lower body, strong throughout the body, and then fast upper body and kind of trunk are kind of the main things we look at.
Are you seeing anything regarding jump strategy? You mentioned obviously like the propulsive impulse. Is there anything like on the eccentric side or the way they're performing the jump?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things I've noticed, it's I haven't gotten enough data points on both the golf swing biomechanics side as well as the jump profiling side, but I've started to notice that the golfers that use more of like a displacement type strategy, so the big kind of big counter movement using the time component of impulse to generate that kind of jump output. They also tend to be the ones in general that use kind of distance as their mechanism in the golf swing. So they do this big upload in the backswing and then they drop down and kind of use more of a squat pattern to generate that vertical force in the downswing, where you also have these golfers that use more of a shallower type of jump strategy, probably have more of that eccentric strength and stiffness in the lead leg. And they make it look a little more like less dramatic in their swing. It's more that kind of like stiffness strategy, really efficient stretch shortening cycle, just that kind of coil post up on the lead leg and just whip it through. So I'm starting to see some of that where obviously if you're kind of lack that ability to create that coiling type mechanism, you're probably going to have to rely on big movements, using momentum to your advantage to kind of create that speed. And in golf, you're not constrained by time in quite the same way as you are in other sports where you don't have a defender. So you can use big displacement in the backswing to kind of create more time for that impulse versus, fighting. You got to land a punch fast or react to your opponent. So you may not have the time to do this big exaggerated wind up. So that's what I'm starting to dig into. It's not just the output side, but just how can we understand when you place a constraint on an athlete, how they tend to perform within something like a counter movement jump? What does that tell us about their kind of preferred strategies within the swing as well?
Do you find those guys as well, like as you mentioned, if you're anything like me, you're short on time. Kids, family, work, training, and having to cook meals on top of that is just not going to happen. So I'm happy to announce Trifecta Nutrition are sponsoring the podcast. You get epic meals like these ones: turkey taco bowl, Texas barbecue protein plate. These are a couple of my favorites. But it means you don't have to prepare all your own meals, and it makes getting in good nutrition relatively easy. I've tried other meal delivery companies. Most of them are too high fat, not enough carbohydrates, or if you're getting kits where you have to cook it yourself, The portions for two is actually for one, especially if you are like me and you're training often. So if you want to take something off your plate and have meals like this delivered to your door, go down the description. There's a link there where you can order trifecta meals. This is the performance line, which are higher protein and higher carbohydrate. And you can use code LIFTBIG40. You'll get 40% off your first order. That kind of the shorter jump guys, like even in my experience, just within multiple sports, like usually the fastest guys in the field or the fastest athletes, they're typically like the stiffer in terms of, we're using the term of like flexibility. So they'll kind of be just stiffer and tighter generally, but that's kind of what leads or lends to them being so fast. Do you find that kind of in there as well between these two kind of athletes or golfers?
Yeah, so there's been a finding in a bunch of research studies, and I've seen it a bunch with modern golfers where there's more of this tendency to create more of that stiffness strategy, like a stable lower body, create that separation, and then kind of post up in the lead leg and whip through with the upper body. That we actually see, like generally golf has been obsessed with flexibility measures. So they
Mm,
always mention trunk rotation, range of motion, which makes sense. But one of the things we consistently see is the lead leg, especially with internal rotation of that hip. Really fast golfers, a lot of the time, will show really low levels of hip internal rotation, range of motion. And it probably has something to do with they kind of create that stability in that lead hip. They don't use the massive range of motion at the hip. It's more create that post up and whip the upper body through with kind of more that stiffness strategy of the lower body. And maybe the other thing is that it's kind of a double-edged sword though, because it's also low range of motion and that internal rotation is also a risk factor for low back pain in golf as well. So it's probably one of those. It's not universally positive. So I wouldn't say the message is don't worry about range of motion
yeah.
if you're a golfer. But there's probably something there where like a lot of these really fast golfers create a really stiff lead leg. And so they don't rely on range of motion of the hip nearly as much, or in the process of creating this kind of stiff, really, you know, post up on the lead leg, they kind of emphasize that over creating a ton of range of motion there.
How does all that information come together to influence a program? Like, for example, the bigger guys who have the bigger range of motion swings versus maybe not so much. Then obviously with the jump data showing maybe their qualities there. How is that all coming together?
A lot of it, in my opinion, starts with like a conversation with their golf coach, as well as like their technical coach, as well as watching them swing. You'd be surprised how often someone has kind of a misalignment between like what they can physically do and what they're trying to do in their swing. They see how Rory McIlroy swings, where he has this really fast hips, really coils up, probably has more range of motion and kind of strength in that kind of end range compared to a lot of other golfers. And they try to apply very similar technical strategy and they just don't have the strength or stability or range of motion in those different joints to do it. So that's usually the starting point is trying to get an idea of what they're trying to do technically. How important is it for them to use kind of a range of motion strategy versus, no, I'm trying to really keep minimal displacement in that lead leg and use more of a stiffness strategy. And from there, you can kind of go into the assessments with that in mind. So even like things like if I know that they want to be able to create the kind of stiff, like not have to rely on this big, exaggerated backswing and then drop hard into the lead leg, they want it to be fairly stiff and kind of coil around it. If I have them do a jump and they perform pretty well, but they do it with this massive counter movement, sometimes I'll try to cue them on something where it kind of forces them to, can you create similar outputs if time is constrained, or you can't use this big exaggerated squat depth because they're trying to just get as high as they can off the ground. So I'll either tell them to jump fast instead of just trying to jump high, or we'll go into something like some drop jumps or multi-rebound jumps. And that can kind of help peel back the layers on, do they have the physical pieces for that? The, re- the reality is like a lot of golfers that I see end up needing a lot of the same types of stuff. They benefit from a lot of the same type of ballistic type work. I'm a believer in eccentric training across a few different areas with most rotational athletes, golfers included. And most of them probably need to kind of always stay on top of trunk range of motion, making sure their hip range of motion doesn't get so stiff that it becomes an issue. So a lot of the strategies become the same, but in terms of like buy-in and communication, and a lot of it is what to take out of programs sometimes where they're just trying to put so much into it because they see what other golfers or coaches are doing.
Mm.
And it's like, we just need to emphasize this because it aligns a little better with what you're trying to do technically. So I don't know if that perfectly answers it, but
That was good. That
yeah,
was good,
it's
yeah. I can imagine a lot of golfers, kinda similar to combat sports, like, maybe they don't have, like, much of a lifting background anyway. So a lot of it kinda comes back to just getting lifting and getting generally strong initially.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we're still at this point where most of them are doing something, but in terms of, I think, like I'd always said that we're already seeing club head speeds increase, distance increasing in golf. But the biggest leap is going to be when we have generations of golfers that have been training their bodies along
Mm.
with the technical side from the time they're 13, 14, like other sports, where right now we kind of have the generation of golfers that picked it up when they were already somewhat established. Maybe they did a little bit and when they were younger, but a lot of golfers, it was first time they really did a structured strength and conditioning program was when they got to college and they had a collegiate strength and conditioning coach or something like that. I think the big change will come when we've had golfers that have bought into training from the time they're junior golfers through college. So they get to college and they're like actually ready to maximize what they can get out of it and then kind of just continue that throughout their careers.
Before I get into the eccentric side, because 'cause I'm excited to get down that eccentric flywheel side. It's kinda what the title of this podcast is, but we're going on this golf rabbit hole, and I'm enjoying it. I've got 2 more questions on this golf. First one, asymmetries. So obviously you're swinging the same way all the time. You're not doing the other way. Ha I let me phrase it this way. Do you think there is a strong risk factor for injury just basically just doing the same side all the time? Is that something you address within strength and conditioning training where maybe you're trying to do rotation the other way more often? Is balancing it out important? Or are you just kind of, hey, if you start trying to balance out this asymmetry, it's going to hurt their performance?
Yeah, it's a bit of a tricky one. I tend to think that asymmetry is kind of a natural part of any sport, especially something like golf, where it's a naturally asymmetrical sport. The I generally think from like a strength and conditioning standpoint, I'm not going to just intentionally train the kind of dominant pattern over and over again just for the sake of doing that. But in terms of like adequately preparing them for their sport, I think a lot of it comes down to just a lot of the general foundation from a physical standpoint, but then a ton of it is workload management. So like I worked with a collegiate golf team for about 3, 4 years. And one of the things I consistently saw is that when golfers would have injuries, it was usually workload related. So a lot of it would be um, they get a swing change with a coach. And so the coach wants them to change their pattern altogether. And the kind of what they end up doing is I need to instill this new pattern. So they take this slightly different pattern they haven't had the chance to adapt to over the course of months or years, like their normal pattern. They're moving in some different way, probably activating muscles a little differently. And then they just hammer it with volume, trying to make it feel comfortable and instill it as quickly as possible. So they have a different pattern and then layer on 3, 4 times the practice volume they normally have. And then it spikes an injury. And the other one is actually after injury. They feel like they've lost out on all this practice time. So they just like jump right back into it. So I think golfers, when they manage volume well, the body adapts to that kind of specific demand pretty well, as long as you can manage the workload. And some golfers, they try to swing in a way that maybe their body doesn't tolerate particularly well. So that's kind of a technical solution. But I've kind of gone back and forth. Like there's this kind of philosophy in golf sometimes to do like speed training work in both directions. So swing non-dominant swings. With like they have like speed sticks that allow you to get over speed training or
I've
with
seen those.
yeah. So they but one of the issues is I've seen that some golfers actually kind of hurt themselves doing the non-dominant swings at times because they're basically swinging in a pattern and in a way they haven't adapted to in the same way they've adapted to their normal swing. Most of them have years and years and thousands of swings progressively getting faster as they developed. And then they suddenly try to throw into the mix this non-dominant swinging as fast as they possibly can with a pattern they're not particularly familiar with. So I think it's probably, if we're going to address it, it just needs to be probably a little more strategic than how it's sometimes done. So Long-winded answer. Yeah, I'm in the gym, and from a strength and conditioning standpoint, we're going to train both sides. We're not just going to train dominant throws, just because it's pretty low risk and pretty low time consuming to just, all right, we did a few sets throwing a med ball in the dominant direction. Let's do it in the other direction as well. So I'm not going to compound that asymmetry intentionally. But in terms of it being a massive issue, I think in a lot of cases it's somewhat overblown.
What's your take on those overspeed sticks?
Yeah, it's something I've given a lot thought to. I think again, it's kind of like golf got its this like fancy new tool that does work, and they just kind of went overboard with it. So a lot of it comes down to the programs. They just follow a very standard program. They have to remember that a lot of these programs that are sold to them are based off of the incentive is getting their swing speed numbers up. They don't really care what happens outside of swing speed. Like these
Mm,
products are designed to make you faster. That's what they're marketed towards. So they'll do really high volumes of these kind of overspeed training tools. And a lot of the time they'll get faster because they're basically putting all of their focus on the feedback is just swinging fast versus swinging fast and making good contact and controlling trajectory. And I think that does have a lot of uses from both like a motor learning perspective, of it kind of like, especially golfers that swing in like a very constrained, like accuracy focused manner when they have this kind of periods where they just focus on swinging faster, they'll move a little more dynamically, they'll use the ground a little differently. So I think it can be really useful when you use it intentionally. It's kind of a motor learning tool of let's try to open up the swing a little bit and then see if we can work some of that into your swing. And then I think just from exposure to like high velocity stimulus, I think it's a lot easier to move like some of these body segments at really fast speeds from like a training perspective when you use overspeed training within a dynamic motion like the golf swing compared to like trying to throw a medicine ball. Like you can get some speed, but not the same amount of speed as swinging a speed stick at 135 miles an hour, however fast. So there's definitely value to it. But I think this idea of like, all I need to do is swing this thing 100 times and it's going to make me a better golfer can definitely take you down the wrong road if you're not too careful.
yeah, some good points. I want to come to the eccentric portion. So lead us well into the flywheel stuff. But we can start at the very base. So like, why do you favor? Why do you like eccentric training so much for rotational athletes?
Yeah, so I think there's a few cases. So like I'll use the example of golf, but I think it applies to a lot. But with golf, there's probably a lot of eccentric loading within the swing that people don't appreciate. So a lot of it is stretch shortening cycles kind of sequenced throughout the body where you create this stretch across the entire lead side of your body during the backswing. And then you're basically having to redirect momentum back into that direction. And then after impact, you're having to decelerate all the segments back to kind of a controlled, stable position. And so for a long time, I don't think that was always appreciated that the eccentric piece was playing a big role. And part of it is that I think a lot of people, if they do any sort of strength and conditioning, get exposed to maybe some eccentric loading for the lower body. Just by doing things like plyometrics, you're going to get some degree of eccentric stimulus that isn't, which I'm sure we'll get into, that gets missed within kind of normal strength training. But then with the upper body and the trunk, which was one of the things that kind of drew me to flywheels in the first place, was just the ability to load up the eccentric phase, either kind of high inertia, high force, or fast, where you're trying to manage and redirect this momentum through kind of these upper body and rotational patterns was something that I just found that a lot of golfers and a lot of rotational athletes in general don't get a lot of in their training unless they intentionally seek it out. From like a physiological standpoint too, there's a degree of a lot of the adaptations that eccentric training brings to the table is useful for speed. So especially the upper body, some of the kind of architectural changes to the muscle. And then the stretch shortening cycle in general is one of the ways we create speed and power during athletic movements. And being really strong during the eccentric phase of the stretch shortening cycles allows you a lot more options with how to perform that really efficiently and powerfully.
What are some examples of rotational eccentric overload you're using? Because I know, like, even if you're using, say, a flywheel and a rack, and you may be doing like your traditional like rotations or wood chops, it can be pretty hard to overload and not be pulled back to the device or anything like that, especially if you're just standing. So, are there any variations that you really like to use?
Yeah, so with like true rotational patterns, when I can, I'll actually lock the foot in place, like have something that you can
Gotcha.
kind of wedge your foot against, so that you can really focus on hammering away at the concentric side, knowing you're going to be able to handle, kind of focus on just decelerating it without you sliding. The other kind of option is I have kind of become a fan of, at the very least, wide stance, maybe kind of hinged at the hips, lowering the center of gravity, so it becomes less of a concern about just being pulled over sideways. The reality is, like, I think with a lot of the golfers I've had use flywheels with for trunk rotation, is anything I can give them is give me more than what they've done in the past. So if you can't
Yeah.
give like true 100% effort, but they're still going to be loading that eccentric phase more than they usually do with kind of their basic type of rotational patterns. The other piece is I really like the motorized rack flies with extra fly, at least where it's adding extra kinetic energy
Yeah.
during the eccentric. You don't have to use maximal effort during the concentric when you can ramp up that motor. So you can kind of have them like put a decent amount of motorized boost in there and then just have them kind of focus on building up some momentum concentrically and then just brace as hard as they can when that thing pulls them back. And it's just kind of a useful, like, it's hard to describe until you try it, but it's a very different stimulus than you're getting with
Yeah.
most of their rotational patterns. And then the last one is I've become a big fan of things like rotational rows or cheat rows with a flywheel, or uh,
Mm.
it's where you can kind of you have a little more stability, but I'm just a big fan of like pulling based eccentric movements anyways for a lot of
Yeah.
athletes. And I'll kind of have big rotation and then they just kind of brace and they're having to rotate, but also
Oh,
with
that's so nice.
involved.
I love that one, and yeah, pulling eccentric is generally hard to do without equipment like that. Like you kind of like maybe like drop catch inverted rows, eccentric quasi isometric pull ups and stuff, which can give you some of that. But outside of that, you don't have too much. Do you have any other variations, whether it's flywheel or non flywheel, for pulling eccentric overload?
Yeah, I mean, flywheels make it a lot easier, which is a big good. So, I mean, obviously, you can like even with the motor, you can do it to any movement, basically get that eccentric overload.
Yeah.
One of the things I'll do with flywheels, even if you don't have a motorized version, then you can do something like pull with two arms and then resist with one. I end up having to do, like, if they don't have a flywheel, then you could use a cable stack, and you're having to do kind of 2-1 method like that as well. It's
Mm,
really different where it's kind of load based versus like velocity or kinetic energy based, where
yeah.
it's going to be more of that slower kind of accentuated eccentric load, but it's still going to have some of that eccentric benefit. I am a big fan of drop catches. So that's kind of become a big piece of what I do, especially with like golfers on the road. They
Yeah.
travel for tournaments, because an eccentric training method they can do if they only have 30 or 40-pound dumbbells at the hotel gym or something, can kind of add some velocity component to that. So those are kind of the go-tos, but that was, I mean, obviously with flywheels, there's a big appeal was you have to get pretty creative to get eccentric loading through definitely upper body, but even non-vertical movements in general. It just kind of helps add options for
Yeah.
easy loading through the body.
For the audience, uh, explain and maybe bust some myths around. Maybe just even just start what flywheel training is, just in case someone doesn't know, and then go into where people often say, "Hey, flywheel's not eccentric overload because it only gives back the effort you put in concentrically."
Yeah, sure. So with traditional resistance training, so a lot of the time you'll see with like flywheel terms, it's your gravity dependent methods, barbells, dumbbells, cable stacks, all of those. The resistance is primarily from overcoming gravity's kind of opposition to your movement. So you're squatting and you have this gravitational force on the weight that you're lifting that you have to overcome. And so there's this gravitational component that you have to overcome, and then it's inertial from there in terms of more force in gives more acceleration. With flywheels, instead of lifting a weight against gravity, we're putting work or performing work or applying force to accelerate these flywheel plates. They're these spinning flywheel plates, which to see right there.
Nice.
And then basically the momentum you build into those plates at the end of the concentric range is going to then cause the rope to recoil in the opposite direction. And then you then have to apply eccentric forces to decelerate it. So I generally talk about it being building up momentum concentrically and then managing or redirecting that momentum during the eccentric phase. And so by default, if you just perform a standard rep, it is going to be about 1 to 1. What you put into the concentric phase is going to be what you have to deal with eccentrically. And that alone is going to be slightly higher eccentric resistance than just lowering a traditional weight on with like kind of a controlled descent. But it's not going to be like a true eccentric overload unless you do basically one of two things. You need to either condense the time period that you're producing that braking force. So this could be something like a delayed braking where you kind of let it pull you back a little bit and then slam on the brakes hard and fast towards the end. Or you have to find a way to add more momentum to the flywheel. So that could be an assisted concentric is kind of the broad category I put on it. So this can be things like using two arms to pull with a row on the way back, and then decelerating with just one exercise based one. So you use more muscle mass on the way up compared to the way down. Um, Common one is like I have that T bar right there. So kind of a hand support bar. You use your hands to help accelerate you up and then just the legs to decelerate. Those definitely work. You get eccentric overload for either part of the range of motion or this big braking demand in something like delayed braking. And then with the assisted concentric, you're adding momentum more than you'd be able to create normally. So you do have this kind of eccentric overload on the way back. The only downside is it's somewhat hard to standardize it and be like really precise with prescribing it and progressing it. It's very technical. So some athletes or some users will be able to do it better than others. But even like rep to rep or week to week, you're probably not going to be able to put this like precise number on it of like, I put 5% extra into that rep. So I'm going to do 8% next week. So with Exaflo, kind of the solution to that was we have the option to add a motor, which we call it the eccentric motorized boost, but you're able to program in a percentage of extra kinetic energy to add on the way back or during the eccentric phase. So you can dictate, I want 5% extra added. And you still could use those technique based strategies if you wanted to add additional element, but it's going to automatically apply more speed to the flywheel so that it kind of guarantees you're going to get that eccentric overload on the way back.
Yeah, that is brutal. That is brutal,
Yeah.
that boost. That, I've got when I was using it quite a bit, one of my favorites for the eccentric boost was doing a hip thrust variation.
Mm.
That was nice, but I think you could only do it on the old version. They had the 2, ropes, and,
Yeah, this is the dual strap. Yeah.
yeah, and it said it's like 30% boost. Man, that was fucking sweet.
Yeah, a lot of people think about like when we say 1 to 80%, they kind of hear like, oh, well, I've done super maximal eccentric loading and I add an extra 25% extra load on the way down. And that alone is really hard, but it's a very different feeling when it's based off of kinetic energy. So it just, you can hear the motor rev and then it adds this extra speed since kinetic energy is going to dictate how much eccentric work you have to do. And you can increase that kinetic energy in one of two ways. You can add inertia, which is pretty much set unless you do something really funky with adding plates like through a set or something. But the easiest way is you just add a small amount of velocity to it, and that has this relatively large effect on how much work you have to do. You can do it at really fast speeds. So you can put a small plate on there and add
Yeah.
10 boost. It's going to feel really fast on the way back. Or you could do it at really high loads, and it doesn't take much extra speed to make it feel like it's really heavy that you have to resist against on the way back. So it gets applied to every rep and it's always relative to what you put in. So that's kind of one of the nice things about it is that even when you're introducing it, people find it intimidating at first. But one of the things I'll have them do is just start with a low percentage boost and sub-maximal effort because it's still based off of how much you put in on the way up. So if you just have them start nice and easy and then kind of get used to that feeling of a little extra pull on the way down, and then they can just build up to full effort, 100% max effort. And then you can start playing around with adding boost over time. And with like some basic systems, most people can pick up on it pretty quick. And then, as you said, you can ramp it up. We could technically go up to 80%. And I don't know of anyone that's really doing anywhere near that. Even 20, 25% for most exercises is going to feel pretty intense.
Yeah. Yeah. That speed when you have, like, the one, like, small blue plate, like, one of my favorites was doing, like, uh hand supported like quarter split squats with the boost, I think I had like an 8% boost on. Holy shit, man, that was hard. The brakes you have to put on with your quads and your glutes as you hit like just like quarter position, you just kind of like almost like an oscillatory ISO, but like
Yeah.
way more resistance and way more load coming in. That's tough.
Yeah, it's one of those we've actually seen a ton of success with one of my colleagues worked at Major League Baseball for a long time, then me with golf. That exact exercise, like a hand supported or a Bulgarian split squat, kind of single leg with having to like decelerate against the motor, and you can play around with like if you get good at managing that momentum at high loads and high speeds, like you're
Hmm.
going to see a lot of that ability to create stiffness through that post up leg like go through the roof pretty quickly. So that's been one of the obvious use cases for us, is if there's a throwing or striking athlete that they can't quite get that post up or that really strong break into the lead leg. um, the flywheel can be a really useful way of training that and building confidence in it too, of just I can handle a pretty aggressive loading into that lead leg and still redirect momentum out of it. Like it's a great way to build confidence through that kind of pattern as well.
With eccentric overload, a lot of people think, or a lot of people default to, okay, if I'm doing eccentric overload, it means I'm doing, I don't know, over 100% of my 1RM, like on a squat as an example. And it's seen as this heavy, slow movement. And so I guess we could just class it as like slow eccentric, and then you've got more like fast eccentric, like we mentioned, like you could do on the flywheel, you could do with drop catches, etc. Where do you, how do you see them being both applied in a sports performance contest? There was a paper not long ago, I can't remember who wrote it. He had a few papers. I think he did his PhD thesis on, I think it was on slow versus fast eccentrics and their transfer to performance. And it'll just be interesting to kind of hear maybe your thoughts around that. Like, can you get away with just doing a slow eccentric because you are getting some of those adaptations favorable for speed?
Yeah, it's a great question. And like one of the questions I get asked is like, how do we base eccentric loading has a slightly different kind of force velocity relationships than concentric, where I basically boil it down to that if you're doing some eccentric overload that's really high force, slower speeds, and you're doing some that's really fast, like you're hitting two really useful things. There's some overlap there with kind of the adaptations they promote, but there's some differences as well. So if you think about like the like really high load, typical accentuated eccentric loading where really heavy, really high kind of tension feels like you're lowering this really heavy weight slowly, you're probably getting a really high total tension because you're getting this really big active tension from kind of the contractile elements in the muscle. You're getting some of the passive tension from like this active stretch of all the more elastic tissues. But it's going to be really useful for just driving really like tendon stiffness, tendon size type adaptations, because a lot of the tendon size and stiffness adaptations is just driven by total tension. So get a lot of tension through that tendon, and a good way of doing that is eccentric overload. You don't need a ton of volume. You don't need a ton of reps, but each rep is going to have a lot of tension involved with kind of those heavy eccentrics. It's probably also really useful for a lot of the strength related adaptations. So a lot of the stuff that's going on for like a maximal force capacity standpoint, you're going to probably some of that like lateral force transmission, motor unit recruitment. There's probably a lot of stuff that's valuable from like a maximal force side. On the fast eccentric sides, though, it's there's like kind of a unique element to it where with the eccentric side, you a lot of the elastic tissues and the viscoelastic tissues like tighten in the muscle, but a lot of the connective tissue around the muscle responds to the velocity of the strain, not just whether it's strained. So even though there's probably less of the like active tension because there's less, maybe a lighter load in the case of a traditional one, or a lower inertial load to deal with, you're getting this really fast strain through the muscle tendon unit. And it seems like that promotes some kind of unique adaptations as well, just because you're going to get this really passive involvement, this big elastic energy storage through things like the tendon that respond to strain rate as well. So you're kind of hitting, there's going to be some overlap that contribute to both speed and strength. So things like fascicle length are probably going to increase in both cases to some degree, because a lot of that is just putting tension through a muscle when it's under active stretch. There's probably a degree of that occurring at both the heavy and the fast side. but there's probably some unique things from like a stretch shortening cycle mechanism standpoint that's happening with that really fast loading, where you're having to like store this elastic strain energy really quickly and then kind of return it back as you redirect the momentum in the other direction. But I think we still have a lot to learn physiologically what's happening there, but there's definitely some unique things each one brings to the table, and you probably want some exposure to each of them over the course of the year.
Are you typically doing them in phases, kind of like using maybe a slower eccentric approach initially, then into fast, or you kind of combining both?
I think it kind of depends. One of the things that I tend to believe with eccentrics is you can get away with relatively low volume if the quality is really, really high. So you could very easily work both of them into either a session or throughout a week. So a lot of the time it may be kind of you work some heavy eccentric squats into one day, or maybe it's more of a strength dominant type day. And then you can work in some of the fast stuff, either kind of microdose throughout the week is what a lot of like team sport coaches end up doing, is kind of this smaller doses throughout, so that they avoid maybe some of the like completely wrecking their athletes and just of all the other stuff they're doing, just tons of fast eccentrics as well. But either that, or you can kind of work it into a speed day. A lot of the eccentric related adaptations don't take a ton of volume to both build and maintain, is kind of the advantage of with like
Mm.
flywheels. We'll see a lot of coaches do kind of dedicated heavy eccentric blocks, and they kind of transition towards more faster as the season gets closer. And then they just kind of microdose a bit of both when they have the opportunities throughout the season, because things like fascicle length detrain really quickly, but it also doesn't take much to kind of maintain it. So there's a study with Flywheel. They did stiff leg deadlifts on a Flywheel device, and they had kind of tracked it over a 39-week Australian Football League season. And they had this kind of dedicated preseason, and they built up their tracking eccentric strength, fascicle length. They had more of a typical like 3 to 4 sets a couple times a week with these eccentric training methods on the hamstrings. You saw all these muscle adaptations and strength kind of go up. They then had a 4 week break for the holidays where they weren't training with the team. Everything dropped kind of back to baseline, but then within a week or two after they returned, shot right back up. And then they had like a 15-week in-season period where they were just doing, it was either 8 to 16 total reps a week. So it was like one session of flywheel on some weeks for one set of 8 reps. And that was enough to actually maintain and even build up some of these adaptations throughout the season. So that's kind of the good news for a lot of athletes where they have kind of long competitive seasons, is you can build it up in the off season, but it doesn't take much to kind of make these incremental gains, even in season. Just dose it when you can, make the
You,
quality high when you do it, but you don't have to overdo it from a volume perspective either.
I need you to send me that paper. Actually, I want to do a video on that. That's a cool paper. I don't think I've read that one or come across that one. It's
Yeah, I'll
a
send it over to you. So they compared Nordics and flywheel based eccentric training, but they tracked it basically across a long period and gave a lot of context about what was going on throughout the year. So those are the
that's
type of
cool.
papers that are really useful, kind of aligning like not just a 6 week block, but what happens in
Yeah.
39 weeks with all the logistical headaches that come into planning strength and conditioning around a busy competitive schedule.
Or a 6 week study that compares like eccentric hamstring to a group that does no strength training.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're like, okay, well, that was helpful. Um, I have a question. Tell me, just if you haven't gone into it deep enough or anything like that, just tell me, because this is throwing a curveball. And it's just because you mentioned Tyson in this thing. And I was like, oh, I was actually starting to go down the rabbit hole a bit and just kind of read more on the winding filament theory versus the sliding filament theory. Are you able to go into that at all? If not, just say so, and I've got more questions for you.
Yeah, to some degree. But the idea is that like what a lot of us are taught, if you do like an undergraduate exercise science class or certification, a lot of it is going to be based off of this original sliding filament theory of basically muscle kinetics, where you have these contractile elements of sorry, like actin and myosin. Sorry, brain fart there.
Very
But
good.
your two contractile kind of elements within the muscle, and they bind together and they perform this power stroke, and that's how you basically generate tension from an active standpoint. So that's what's happening with basic muscle contractions, particularly during concentric and isometric type actions. But over the years, they kept basically struggling to bridge the gap with what was explaining the facts that force was so much higher with eccentric training or eccentric contractions. There was less metabolic demand as well. So if you perform the same amount of work with an eccentric action compared to a concentric or isometric, the eccentric action is way more metabolically efficient, requires way less energy. And then they were also basically finding the force velocity relationship, where it's this whole component of eccentric actions can actually increase force with speed up to an extent, and then it kind of plateaus. And so all these kind of unanswered questions led them to eventually kind of start to look into whether there's an elastic element within the muscle that was helping explain the behavior. And it seems like this really primary candidate is titin, which is the biggest protein in the human body, but it basically spans half the length of the sarcomere, or basically stabilizes the entire contractile elements of muscle fibers. And originally it was thought to be mainly like a structural kind of component, probably, where maybe not as much of a active participant in muscle contractions. What they found over time is that when the muscle is activated, so you have calcium flowing through the muscle fiber, for example, that it tends to have this behavior of it can regulate its stiffness. So the winding filament theory is starting to think that it wraps around that actin, this kind of thin filament, and actually helps stabilize it and actually helps kind of store and then return elastic strain energy. But it can regulate its stiffness, and it helps stabilize and kind of improve the efficiency of the entire contraction process when it's being actively stretched. So there's this degree of titin pride plays this really important role during eccentric action, specifically if it kind of acts like the tendon does at the muscle tendon unit level, where it stores strain energy as it gets stretched and then recoils and releases that energy, but also maybe winds up against these kind of contractile proteins and helps stabilize them during muscle actions as well. So don't know
Not
if that's the perfect answer, but they're starting to basically identify that there's these massive protein within muscle fibers that does more than just hold things in place. It's definitely contributing to why eccentrics produce this high level of force.
perfect. Perfect. I didn't put you on the spot with a massive curveball then, so I'm glad. I'm glad that came through well. But if we go back to the flywheels, obviously it's all kind of related anyway. But do you have a general progression that you use maybe with athletes on a flywheel? Because I think some people might, you look at a flywheel, you kind of, as you mentioned, it's not low. You're not putting in 60 kgs and 80 kgs or whatever. You're putting on like a big red plate and then a big blue or small blue plate or whatever. So you kind of not sure, like, how does that look for you?
Yeah, that's been one of my big like priorities so far this year, is that what I'm realizing is people are starting to realize that eccentric training is this really useful thing for certain adaptations, for certain outcomes. A lot of athletes are doing it. A lot of them are seeing benefits from it. And they recognize that flywheels are useful for that perspective. But when it comes to, I have a flywheel device in front of me, how do I create a system around it? That's been kind of one of the big gaps that I'm trying to solve right now. So the problem, just to kind of put it in perspective, is that a lot of people, when they think about how they program resistance training, it's based off of gravity dependent principles, like one repetition max, where there's a maximal weight that you can lift against gravity. With flywheels, we can't rely on that concept because there's not really a maximal weight you can lift during flywheels. It's more, the example I use is like right now I have 4 large plates stacked on my flywheel device, but my 2-year-old daughter can still go in there. And if she kind of spins it, it'll still spin. Like she could do a complete rep with it. It's just, it's going to be spinning so slow that the force demand of that movement is really, really low. So it's rarely a question of whether you can complete a rep. It's how much force and how well you can accelerate those plates on there against that inertia. And it's one of the kind of unique qualities of it. You could have 5 people perform the same exercise, same inertial load on there, and they're actually going to get a very different resistance that scales to how much they can put into it. But it also means that you can't rely on these like very observable factors, like did they complete the rep, or how many reps did they complete before technical failure. So what we usually bring into it is, one, it's for a complete beginner. The reality is, if you look at a lot of the flywheel training research, which frustrates me that there hasn't been more of an effort to kind of develop like solid like frameworks for
Just
progressing.
send me a device. I'll start some research for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. but there's like basically a lot of beginners to the training method. It's so novel that you can just basically get them on a load that makes sense and just tell them to try to accelerate it faster over time. And at least in the short term, they're going to progress because as they get stronger, they're going to put more into it. The resistance is going to increase. The eccentric load is going to scale to that. It's not really the most structured and like systematic way of doing it. So I've also tried to come up with ways where most flywheel devices, including ours, have sensors built into them. And so we measure mechanical outputs like velocity, torque, power, things like that. But even then, I hand someone the app and they're like, okay, what do I do with these metrics? It's cool that it measures this. And so I'm starting to develop really simple, like very simple methods using just like one metric. Like, let's just start with velocity. And why I like velocity is that when we think about the resistance that flywheel training generates, it's building up momentum or kinetic energy, whichever perspective you want to think about it from during the concentric phase. And then that gets returned as an eccentric resistance on the way back. And whether you think about it as momentum or kinetic energy, the variable that's getting modified is the speed that you're spinning in inertia. More speed means more kinetic energy against the same load or more momentum that you build up. So in either case, velocity is telling you basically if your velocity at a given load is going up, that's generally a sign that the resistance is going up as well. The other piece too is that, in my opinion, the major reason that different inertial loads can kind of promote strength versus speed related adaptations is that they constrain movement speed. So if you want to target really high force, especially during like the concentric phase, you're going to use a higher inertial load because it constrains your speed to where you're putting a lot of effort in, but you're moving relatively slow. So it's going to feel heavy. You're putting this effort in, but you're still going up relatively slow. On the way back, it's this heavy load or feels heavy, but you're resisting it relatively slow. And that means you have more time to produce maximal force. If you only have 0.2 of a second to produce force, you're going to get a lot of useful stuff out of that, but you're not going to maximize force within that movement. So it just puts you in this kind of mechanical position where it emphasizes really high levels of force. And then if you go the other direction, like a small flywheel that's going to accelerate really fast, you're probably not going to produce as much mean force. There's not going to be as much total impulse or work performed, but you're basically applying this really fast eccentric stimulus that we talked about before. So kind of bringing it all around, you could basically just say, I'm going to focus on velocity. I'm going to find a load for my strength sessions that are basically I'm working as hard as I can, but the speed is relatively slow. So 0.5 meters per second or slower maybe is a good starting point. And on the speed side, I'm going to do one that I can move relatively fast, but still kind of without it getting out of control. And then with the strength side, we're just going to either basically try to progress the load at that speed. So once that speed starts to creep up, we just add some load. It's going to bring you back down. Then same thing, just build it back up. All you're tracking is velocity against that load. On the speed side, we're trying to get faster and faster against that load over time. And then we can play around with things like adding eccentric overload methods to make it even faster, use the motor to progress the velocity even faster. You could decrease the load to really ramp up the speed, but basically you could go into it and say, I'm going to pick a load based off of velocity. I'm going to try to make that velocity go up over time. And then when it makes sense, add a plate or take a plate away, depending on if you want to make it faster or feel heavier or higher force. And then just basically progress that way and track one metric over time. So that's my general approach. And then I'll work with other people. Some people like more of a power-based approach. And generally what we'll do is find the load where they produce the highest power. Some people want to train at that peak power load or that optimal power load. I tend to like to kind of split it up into the speed component and the strength component of power. So we then just pick a load that's slightly slower than that for the strength day, faster than that for the speed day. And then we want to see that kind of power across the entire profiles going up over time.
Nice. Nice. I like that approach. I've one final question for you that actually comes back to golf a bit, back to this the overspeed stick stuff, kind of. But using the swing in like a skill complex. So obviously, if someone's doing like traditional complex training for anyone listening and like squat and then jump. But perhaps there's something you're doing in there. I mean, even happens in combat sports too, I guess, where people might be doing like a squat and maybe throwing combinations on a heavy bag. And for this example, might be a squat and a throw, or a throw and some kind of main swing. Is that something you've played around with at all, or something that interests you?
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely played around with it a bit. The person that I've seen do a lot of that is, I don't know if you know William Wayland.
Yep, he's been on
He
the
actually
podcast
works.
twice.
Oh, okay, yeah, perfect. So he kind of has this unique background working with combat sports as well as golfers. So he kind of has this unique perspective living in both of those worlds. But with golfers, he works with the DP tours, the European professional tour, quite a bit. And he works with some long drive guys that are really, really fast. And he kind of termed this concept of like kind of a modified French contrast type complex where it's like ascending correspondence. But he does a lot with once a golfer has a pretty good foundation where it's even worth going into more of these like advanced methods versus like, let's just build some strength and do
Yeah,
some stuff and try swinging fast once in a while. He'll do something like a heavy squat, medicine ball throw, and then these overspeed swings and kind of cycle through that and tracking velocity. And if velocity drops off and the overspeed swings, then sets over. We're focused on high quality. So it's definitely one of those I've seen some success, especially with a golfer that has a fairly good foundation already. And there's probably definitely something to it where it just kind of makes sense to pair those things together.
nice. Nah, perfect, Alex. Where can people find to follow you and keep up with all your information?
Yeah, I'm probably most active on Instagram. So I have kind of an Exafly specific account. I think it's my name underscore Exafly, maybe something like that. And then my kind of main account, I post a variety of stuff. A lot of my golf related stuff is there. I think it's my name PhD, if I had to
Yeah,
guess. I forget what
I'll
my
put it in the description too.
yeah. So that's probably where I'm most active. I'm usually pretty responsive. People message and have questions. So I'll try to keep tabs of it.
Perfect. I'll link those all up in the description for anyone who's keen to see what he's up to. You post some good information, good data on his Instagram, especially around golf and stuff. So check that out, and I appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.